This is Conversation Balloons, a podcast of interviews with experts and friends about all things generational. I'm your host, Leah Farish. I'm bringing you today the founder and CEO of Principal Matters, LLC, William D. Parker. He just started full-time with Principal Matters, although he's been the visionary for it all this time. His 30 years of education experience are distilled in this project and in his consulting and podcasting work and in his 3 books. So thank you so much for taking the time, Will, to be with us today.
Leah Farish, it's my pleasure to be with you. And, you know, we've been friends a long time.
Will is a renowned leader of leaders, you guys. He serves as executive director of Oklahoma's Association of Secondary Principals and Middle Level Educator Association. And I wanted to talk to him today about how families can better be supportive of principals, how they can understand them. Certainly things have gotten a little fraught between public school administration and families the last couple of years. You might have noticed.
And it's not just public schools. You know, first of all, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And let me just set a few clarifications. I just have wrapped up serving 6 years as Oklahoma's executive director for the Association of Secondary School Principals and Middle Level Education Association. And that work wrapped up June 30th of 2023. And now Principal Matters is my full-time work.
Okay.
And but simultaneously, as you know, I've been writing books, doing content, creating podcasts, speaking on behalf of education and my area, specifically education leadership, now for almost 10 years, Leah. You and I've talked and shared and collaborated for a long time. I remember when you invited me to speak to graduate classes in education and some of the school law work that you've done. So thank you for the friendship and this opportunity. But in this work, the joy of education is I have had the opportunity through Principal Matters to do coaching and professional learning with principals in public school settings, charter school settings, Christian school settings, Catholic school settings. And so it's just been such an amazing privilege to see the variety of ways communities and leaders are discovering to serve students. And so I think we have way more in common than we have different when it comes to some of the questions that you're asking about how to serve families.
Mm-hmm. How has that landscape changed in the last 15 or 20 years? The relationship between a school's families and its administration?
That's a great question. I would say in some ways it hasn't changed, and in other ways it has. Let me talk first about the ways it hasn't changed. The ways that it hasn't changed is that the responsibility of an educator or an education leader should still always be first to build relationships of trust. And so no matter the time period you live in, the setting you live in, the size of your school or school community, first and foremost, students need to know that they're safe, that they can trust you in their learning. Parents need to know that their students are entering a place where they're safe and can be trusted in learning. And your community needs to believe in you too, because you're not just a part of what's happening between students and parents. Every school is a part of building a community of learning too. Where I would say some things have changed over the last few years is really the things that are almost impossible to control. And those would be more political. I think there's a lot of, and not just political, but social. There are things that come to leaders in their work that are just sometimes new. I'll give you an example. I know you had Tim Elmore on as a guest, and you guys have talked a lot about generational dynamics. And I was with Tim a few weeks ago in Atlanta for a think tank that he hosted. And he brought Jean Twang into the conversation through a Zoom meeting. And we were in a room with about 17 other leaders. Some of them were his executive team from Growing Leaders. Some of them were college interns who were Gen Zs themselves, but serving in the summer with growing leaders. Several of the people in the room were educators from the Georgia area, teachers. Michael Kabita, who was the Georgia State Principal of the Year, was in the room. And there were a couple of business owners, some consultants, a Chick-fil-A manager, just to get a sense of what is life looking like for all of us as we're stepping in. And there were some dynamics we were discussing that were new. As you know, the advent of the smartphone has brought new ideas and students into conversations that are different than from what we've seen before. We have students with much higher levels of anxiety. We have students with much higher rates of suicide. We have greater exposure to trauma, whether that's in real life or virtually for our students. And so with that comes a whole new set of challenges for educators and education leaders to make sure that they're working collaboratively with parents for those areas. So I would say, Leah, that's one example of the way things have changed.
Well, and I think it would be really helpful to families to just hear you tell us a typical, there are no two alike, I know, but a typical day in the life of a principal.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, there is no typical, but I think it might be helpful. Thank you for permission to set some context. So I want you to imagine that you're up early in the morning before the sun. And if you plan to do any kind of physical fitness in the life that you lead, you're going to have to do it at 5 a.m. or you're going to have to do it at 5 p.m. And that's not untypical for other professions either. But in my work, life begins very early because you're usually going to be trying to get to the school an hour or so before the students arrive so that you can unlock doors, check your mail and email, make sure that you're answering phone calls. And a lot of times you're setting up meetings before school because that's when parents can meet with you before their kids begin school so they can get to work on time. Or maybe you're also managing those meetings in after-school settings so you can help parents meet with you at times that are convenient for them. But your day never starts off slowly when you're in an education leadership because as soon as you step in, there's almost always somebody who's left a message for you or someone who's there to see you or a phone message to answer or an email to respond to, because your role as a leader is to help navigate other people's difficulties and challenges. And so it comes with the territory. So you'll spend most of your day, even if you've got scheduled events like teacher observations or student activities or maybe a field trip or something that's happening within the day, you'll spend most of your day navigating those meetings around other things that come up that weren't scheduled. So when a parent calls, they're almost always going to be calling you along with other parents that are calling or other people that are wanting your attention. So a school leader spends a lot of time hopefully setting up their school in a way where they have a team of people helping them manage instruction and busing and lunches and counseling and all the other services that are being provided, individual education plans for special education students, all these things that are happening every single day so that they're available to provide direction and guidance and instruction back to the people that are managing all those responsibility areas. And then responding to the needs of students and parents. Probably the hardest part, and you and I have talked about this in other settings, I did many years as an assistant principal, a lot of the student behavior management, which means that in addition to all the other responsibilities of curriculum and instruction, you're often dealing with helping parents navigate some of the hardest moments they're going to have with their own students' behavior, and maybe sometimes helping students navigate some of the, I'm just going to say, worst decisions they've made in their lives, and trying to help them figure out, okay, how do we both hold you accountable for the things that you're doing, but also teach you a lesson about trust and growth and regaining trust. And so those are some really, really, but they can be both endearing sometimes, and sometimes they can be exhausting depending on the outcomes. But The goal is to work in partnership with your teachers and your students and your families so that together you're helping students learn and grow.
Mm-hmm. And so you get through the school day galloping at that pace, and then the bell rings for the final class, and you're doing what for the next couple of hours?
Well, if you're lucky, you're going to be helping finish up supervision and bus duty and making sure every kid gets home. And you might be able to grab an hour or so to catch up on some emails and to respond to correspondence or to make phone calls. And you're usually, depending on the setting, but I would say most school leaders are then going to check into their evening responsibilities, which often involve supervising basketball games or softball games or attending volleyball practices or you name it, drama, theater, especially at the secondary level, but really at every level, it seems now you've got student activities that drive a lot of your afternoons and into your evenings, depending on the time of the year. So my wife likes to call, December, my wife used to always tell me as the wife of an administrator, she would say was the hardest month to be married to an educator because Christmas means everyone wants to do a play or an activity or an event or something, and you're invited all of them. So that means so you're at school all day and you're at school most evenings. And then the second hardest time of the month, she calls Maycember, which is the end of the year because you're wrapping up everything. So everybody has a spring concert or their last activity or graduation ceremony or something that you're invited to as well. Every senior event, you're at them. So it's both fun and exhausting. And so those are, that's just a small taste of what it looks like as you're stepping from morning to afternoon. A lot of educators I know, including myself, try to build their work to include their family. So one of the joys that I had was bringing both of my oldest daughters to school with me so we could ride together in the morning. I could see them throughout the day. They'd step in to grab lunch from my office and we could be together after school and I could attend their activities or sometimes they went with me to attend activities. So, combining that work family time does make it very special and it's what worked for us.
That's pretty genius. When you started your first, say, assistant principalship, what did you want to accomplish with that year, and how did your aspirations change through the years?
Yeah, I think I'll just speak to the story that I often will tell in my own leadership journey. And whether it's helpful or not, it may set some perspective. But when I stepped from the classroom as an 11-year classroom language arts teacher, AP Lang teacher, creative writing teacher, into school leadership, I wanted to provide the kind of supervision, support, problem solving that I had found in some of my administrators or had yearned for in others. So I wanted to be the kind of leader that I had appreciated in some of the examples I had, or I wanted to be the kind of leader that I had wished I had seen in some of the others. And so I had had the privilege of working in a couple of different districts by then. And so I had had some exposure to various leadership styles. But what I discovered was that the capacity that one person has to answer every question, to try to find a solution for every problem, to try to help navigate the conflicts that happen sometimes between teachers and students can become overwhelming if your mindset is what I call the superhero mindset. Like, I'm going to help solve these problems. I'm going to show up today and be that person that can be the answer finder. And so I'll give you an example, Leah. I would walk through the school with a notebook tucked under my arm, and every person that stopped me with a question or something, I would write it down and I would promise them, I would help them find a solution. And I would spend hours at the end of the day following up on emails or answering those questions or trying to find the solution for those things. And the first year of my school leadership, I was getting up earlier than I ever had, going to bed later than I ever had, but also not doing anything to take care of me. I wasn't exercising any longer. I wasn't sleeping well. I wasn't having very good nutrition. I wasn't spending as much time with my family. But in the context of school, I think the key is discovering that we have to tuck in your cape, stop pretending to be a superhero, and start working with others collaboratively.
I imagine that one of the draining things is facing threats of liability. As an attorney, I have to admit, I have filed suit on behalf of some people that were suing school districts, and it always would break my heart to do that, but it was always the last resort. But I read that at any given time, every administrator is facing at least one lawsuit that's pending against them.
Wow.
Terribly stressful.
Well, I'll say, first of all, because I know and trust your work, you take on such just causes when it comes to the need to represent.
Only the very most just.
Yes, you do.
Falvo versus Owasso.
I'm just glad I was never on the other side of you. But I'm just also really, really proud of your work. The answer to that question is, I've never actually had anyone tell me that statistic, but it doesn't surprise me, because I'm just thinking back to almost every leader I know at some point has either faced a threat of a lawsuit or they've had charges filed on them for something. And that may surprise people to know that, but I can even think of an example in my own leadership where I'll tell the story, because I think this is not going to divulge confidentiality or create any kind of liability, but this was more than a decade ago. Football game, student comes up to me and says, I think there's a group of boys on the top row that are vaping. This was back when vaping just started. So I couldn't see anybody with anything. So I walked up to the group of boys and began to address them. And one of them had his head down with his cap pulled over his eyes. So I reached down and pulled the bill of his hat up so I could see his eyes. And I said to all of them, listen, I don't know what's going on up here, but if there's anything inappropriate or against school rules, that has to stop. And if I catch you, obviously there's going to be consequences. And I walked away, because that was, at that point, all I could really do. And I was actually, that following weekend, our son Jack was like in second grade. This is a side story, but it's connected for a reason. He got really sick. We took him to the ER, and he got diagnosed with Kawasaki disease, which is a infection in your vascular system. So he ended up in 10 days of treatment. I was absent from school many of those days to be present with Jack while he was recovering, getting him home. The first day that I'm back, so I'm gone for 10 days. First day that I'm back to my office, a police officer walks in and he says, well, I know you just got back from your son's hospitalization. I'm so sorry that this is your first conversation, but I need to let you know that you have a parent who's filed charges against you because you touched his son. You at the ball game, apparently he says that you grabbed him by the hat, and that's an assault. And so I'm just here to deliver the message that I need to interview you, and that I need to process this through our district attorney's office and determine whether or not there's going to be any charges, blah, blah, blah. And so, but Leah, that's just part of the work. And so I wasn't upset. I was just like, well, sit down and let's get to business. And so he interviewed me. I gave him my report. And frankly, by that time I had been an administrator so long, I just forgot about it. I just was like, I'm just going to go about my work and do the work that I'm doing and let him do his work. Mm-hmm. But I also recognized that there was a relationship component here too, in addition to the legal one. And so, once I let him do his work, I made it a point to reach out to that young man personally and just say, hey, I'm just aware that this is the process. I need to let you know that I've been interviewed. I just need to let you know. I don't apologize for doing my work, but I did not want to make you feel uncomfortable or treat you in a way that made you feel unsafe. And so I just wanted to reestablish that relationship with him. And then about 2 weeks later, they followed up with me and said that the DA was like, I'm not interested in this case. This is not a chargeable offense. But the good news is that I still had a really good relationship with that student, because through that process, it really wasn't him who was upset. It was his parent. And in that process, it was also a parent who was not the kind that liked to sit down and have conversations. And so I had to work sadly, in that situation, I had to work around the parent to work with that young man instead of working with the parent.
Yikes.
Yeah. So the answer to your question is yes. School leaders often deal with situations that are way bigger than just what's going on at school.
We always tell our clients to avoid being sued. You have to have 2 of the 3 of these things all the time. Always be right, always be liked, and always be on time.
Oh,
you can drop the ball on one of those, but if you drop the ball on 2, you may well get sued.
I'm writing that down.
Yeah.
Always be right.
Always be right. Always be liked, and always be on time.
Well, here's something. Can I add to that too? Because Daniel Pink wrote a book called When, W-H-E-N, The Science or Art of Timing. And I can't remember the subtitle, but it was a book where he had studied the science of timing when you're talking about what you said about always be on time. And he said in his research on doctors who are sued for malpractice, that the vast majority of doctors sued for malpractice are not liked. So it's not that they're necessarily even, there are many doctors who do things that they could be sued for malpractice, but because their patients like them so much, they don't. They figure out a way to work together and negotiate a settlement. And so I think about that in terms of leadership a lot too, that relationship component is super important in terms of not that everyone always has to like you, but you should treat them in a way where they feel dignified. And I'm sure in that situation, that student didn't feel that way. And so that was an important bridge for me to repair.
I would imagine most families like you pretty well. What I see in parents, having grown up in public school in a family that had numerous public school teachers, still does, is there 2 ends of the spectrum on parent or family involvement. I keep saying family because a lot of my listeners may not realize that so many of our public school students are not living with either parent.
That's right.
Someone else other than a parent is making decisions, and sometimes very hard for them to know what to do. But there are 2 ends of a spectrum of involvement from the home. One is extremely uninvolved and irresponsible. Where mom is a sex worker and she's not there. There's a different man in the house every night, or auntie is raising them and there are 11 children in that home and she's overwhelmed and really can't attend to anyone individually. Or the other end of the spectrum, the helicopter parent who has, as Shakespeare would say, sensibilities as tender as a snail's horn. Everything is offensive or potentially menacing to their child and is impairing their ability to get a good shot at the scholarship for college. And it seems like there aren't all that many families in the middle, unfortunately. But
you're so right on.
And it's hard to devise policies that will apply equally, isn't it, to all families?
And that's why I think that policies are, and you know this, policies are never going to replace the importance of people. Policies are only as good as the people who implement them. And so, because no policy, no matter how well written, is ever going to be perfect. And so, I've seen that too. I coach principals that work in very high-end affluent communities, and I coach principals that work in very low-income, disconnected, or sometimes no guardians at all. And you're right, the stresses are different. In the more affluent communities, sometimes they are having to deal with students whose anxiety is not because they're not provided for or they don't have enough food to eat or because they're traumatized in unsafe environments, their anxiety is that they don't feel like they could ever please or perform well enough for their parents.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a reality. And then at the other end, you've got kids. I've coached and worked with a principal whose kids walk to school from places where they don't have guardian support, and they're not getting home at night till 9 or 10 o'clock because they want to stay for activities, but they're in charge of their own ways to get to and from school. And so the school is their home in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a whole nother level of trauma and stress that they're dealing with. And so as an educator, you're right. You've got parents on either end of those that you have to figure out. That's why I also am really hesitant for one-size-fits-all solutions, because most of the time when we're assessing what's quote-unquote wrong with schools, the solutions we want to apply are to the places that we understand and the culture in which we live. But that doesn't necessarily mean it applies for everyone. And even within a school community, just because that solution might be what's best for your child doesn't always mean it's going to be best for what's best for someone else's child. Mm-hmm. I mean, we know that as parents, that not what was best for one of our children may not be best for another. Well, multiply that by 200 or 400 or 2,000, and recognize that the policies are there to guide you. Mm-hmm. It takes a lot of wisdom and in relationship and trust to apply those things in ways that actually fit the students that are under your care.
Mm-hmm. I bet. How can a family that has a concern approach the school successfully?
I think I'm going to quote Brene Brown, even though I hesitate to say that because it makes me sound like I'm a groupie. And I admire her work, but this is something I'd like to quote that she says often, which is first assume best intentions. Mm-hmm. And I think that works both ways. I think it works when if I say this to principals too, assume best intentions. I have a principal friend who likes to remind us other principals that every child in your building was someone's baby. Mm. And so he actually, Jerry Bridges is his name, and he actually gives, as a professional learning, like whatever you want to call it, gimmick tool, he gives out to each of his staff members a pacifier to keep in their classroom, so that when they're getting really angry and they want to address this kid bluntly, they can first look at the pacifier and remember, this is somebody's baby. To make sure that you're addressing them in a way that if their parent was standing there, they would also want them addressed that same way and still held accountable. But when it comes to the parent, I think it's important to just first assume best intentions, assume that educator also wants what's best for your child. They want to see the child learning. They want to see the child safe. They want to see the child cooperative. They want to see the child thriving and flourishing too. And so, but it takes both. I remember my very first year teaching where I called a mother upset with a boy in my classroom, and I had tried all my tricks. None of them seemed to be working. So I called the mother, and I was a green, brand new teacher. And so I started the conversation off by saying, Billy has been doing these things in class, and it's becoming really distracting, and it's becoming a problem. And I just needed to call you to see if you could support us at home in reminding him of how his behavior is affecting his classmates. And she listened, and then she asked me a question I've never forgotten. She said, well, Mr. Parker, before I respond, can I just ask you first, do you like Billy? And I was so thrown off guard. First of all, I was thrown off guard because I felt like, none of the things I just said were heard. But I him and hawed and tried to figure out how to respond to that question. And she was still supportive. And, but afterwards I went down to the office and I found the assistant principal was an old veteran teacher. He had taught for 20 years. And I told him the story, and he just listened politely. And he said, well, can I give you a few pointers? And I said, sure. And he said, well, first of all, Will, when you reach out to a parent, think about those things about the child that you appreciate and make sure that they recognize the partnership that you have together. And also, I would just remove the word problem from your vocabulary.
Wow.
Just say, we have a challenge here or a situation here, and then invite them to help you resolve it. And I just kept that little short script in my brain every single time from that point on when I have conversations with parents, because it's helpful when you can resolve conflict knowing you're in it together. So I would flip that narrative back on parents and say, when you're reaching out to a teacher or a principal, it's helpful for them to know that you're on their side too, that you want what's best for the whole school. You want what's best for that whole class. You want what's best for the student. So how can we together find a solution that's going to be what's best for everybody? Because I think when we assume the best intentions on the part of the other person, then we work together to find a way to help.
I really believe that you can use a lot of words and have a lot of constructs in your mind, but you will telegraph your assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And so to work on those, you will telegraph respect and an expectation of a healthy outcome, rather than I heard on one of your podcasts, and guys, he has 300 and how many now?
350.
That's so wonderful. One of them, someone said, it may have been you, it may have been your guest, I'm not striving to win an argument. I'm striving for agreement. And that's what you're saying, find that common ground and emphasize we're both pulling on the same side here. We're not pulling against each other.
That's so good.
Yeah. And having been a classroom teacher and department head for 4 years, which it wasn't long, but I did feel like the parent always would come away from a conversation or a parent-teacher conference knowing more of the big picture than they went in. They think they know the big picture. They don't. There's more information you can fill in for them that will mollify somewhat and give them a little more creativity and what.
Yeah. Well, I'll add
do.
another suggestion for parents too. And this is sometimes it's the amount of time you can commit is really dependent on other factors. I know work and life create a lot of pressures, but if you have that opportunity to connect with things going on at your school, so that you can get to know your teachers and principals in those settings, just building that relationship, just connecting, saying hello, just stopping in to chat, just sharing family time, those kinds of relationships, man, they save a lot of time later, because then you don't have to figure out, do we trust each other here? You already do. Yeah. And so that trusting relationship just gives you the ability to step right into problem solving and avoid all the questions of who are you and who am I and whether we can trust each other.
That's so good. I wanted to ask you about a conversation I had. I've taught school law in 3 postgraduate institutions. So these were students who, some of them already were principals, a couple of superintendents. They were getting more graduate education in the field of education. And I'm giving an assignment, and it was, do a 3 to 5 page paper on such and such. I can't remember what it was, but a young woman came up to me afterwards and said, well, you didn't give us any rubrics. I need rubrics. And I said, well, you're a graduate student in the field of education. I think, you know what constitutes a good paper. And she said, but we have to have rubrics. And I said, you know what? Life doesn't have rubrics. You just have to figure out what your goal is, how you're going to meet it, what constitutes success, what the criteria for evaluating your work are, and do that. And she was just absolutely baffled. And I just wanted to ask you, was that unrealistic and insensitive of me? Or was she just not rising to the occasion of initiating her own set of criteria for success.
Having not been present, I will assume best intentions. So, and I'll assume them on your part first, which is that, in the graduate work that I did on my master's degree, I'm trying to think, but I'm not sure anyone ever gave me a rubric. Now, there were some times maybe in like research projects where there were certain expectations that, these are certain things to make sure you include.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's so many times that I've done writing at that level where you're correct. The assumption is that what are the important things to communicate when you're picking a topic and when you're arguing a point or summarizing research. So maybe a follow-up question I would have asked if I had been quick enough to think about how to turn this into a learning moment, I'd have said, why don't you think about what are the most essential things you want to communicate through this paper and write those down and let them become your rubric.
Mm-hmm.
And so let them guide you. I've also found recently with both, I know there are pros and cons to ChatGPT, but one of the things that ChatGPT does a really good job of is creating rubrics. You can type in the directive. I would like to write the following, or even I would like to assess the following, and these are some things I'm looking for. So there's just so many ways, whether you want to create a rubric or for yourself, or you need to create a rubric that would guide someone else. But no, I don't think that was inappropriate of you,
Okay.
Dr. Flourish, for expecting a graduate level student to just take that information and respond in a way that was intelligent and articulate enough to get across what should be.
Yeah. At some point in the educational process, we become scholars. And I had this overwhelming sense that you need to be a scholar now. And especially since your graduate field is education. But I was also thinking, here is a woman who wants to be a principal, who wants to be able to go into a school and make it better. And is she going to wait for someone to tell her how to do that? Is she going to wait for someone to tell her how to do her job? But Will, how do you balance the creative impulse in a job like that, the innovation that a good principal uses with being a bureaucrat and implementing what you have to implement down to the last soul-killing detail every day? How do you do that? How are you this happy warrior in this field?
When I'm working especially with school leaders, I usually will probe with this question. How would you describe the work and the atmosphere of your most highly effective teachers?
Mm-hmm.
So think about the best teachers in your building. And I want you to describe for me what that looks like. If that's what a great classroom looks like, what do you think a great school looks like?
Mm-hmm.
And who's responsible for helping a school, the whole school community, to be a place where the expectations, the procedures, the policies are clear and well understood, and there's the right kind of environment for safety and trust, and a place where people recognize they can try new things, they can discover, they can experiment, and they're going to be supported in that work. And then they're going to be celebrated for the things that they're discovering and learning in that process. That's what a school-wide learning environment looks like. In my first role as a school administrator, the superintendent I worked with in that role was Dr. Mary Jane Bias. And one night I attended a parent meeting that she was hosting with maybe 100 parents. And I was so struck at how engaged everyone was and how clear she was, and just how it was it wasn't just a sit and get, it was a very vibrant conversational town hall style meeting. And when it was over, I just went up to her and I was like, wow, that was a really great parent meeting. And she said, well, why did you think it was good? And I just said all those things I said to you. And she said, well, here's a key. Every setting is a classroom. So tonight I ran this parent meeting just like I did my classrooms. And if you'll just keep that in mind, you're going to be okay.
You know, F. Scott Fitzgerald said, success is a matter of atmosphere. And it's amazing to me how different schools have such different atmospheres. But she created a good atmosphere in that room. Well, I have a final question just about the pressures that you're seeing on communities right now. I'll frame it this way. I heard someone say, leadership is the answer. Now, what's your question? What questions is the community asking you? What questions is the student asking you in this moment in your career and in history?
What a great quote. And I'd like to bring it full circle to that conversation that I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, which was the think tank that I got to sit in with Dr. Tim Elmore in Atlanta, when Jean Twain came in and talked about the research that she has done. And specifically, she's done a lot of research around the advent of the smartphone. And the earlier a child is using a phone, the science shows the more anxiety that they tend to have in comparison to their peers. There were other people in that room from the business settings that were expressing how hard it is to hold on to workers since COVID. The Chick-fil-A manager that was in that conversation said before COVID, he could hire a student worker and have them for 3 to 5 years because they were so valued being able to work there, and it was an environment that they really liked. But he said now, even with everything picking back up and business picking back up, it's hard to hold on to a student for more than 6 months. And so we asked him, well, what is that? And he said, well, really 2 reasons. One, customers have become harder to work with now than they were before COVID. For some reason, they're shorter tempered, they're less patient. And students have discovered there are other places they can work with less stress. These are the 5 things that current dynamics that I see especially affecting U.S. schools. One, you know this, you mentioned this earlier, we are increasingly a parentless generation. Nearly 30% of our U.S. children are now being born into single-parent households. So an alarming number are being raised by grandparents and caregivers. Number 2, and I do, by the way, I have an accompanying post that I can let you put in your show notes that link to the research that supports these statements that I'm saying. Number 2, we are an increasingly childless generation because U.S. birth rates have not only have they been declining, but they're not matching the numbers of people that we're losing in our aging generations. Mm-hmm. And so we're a society that's seeing fewer children being born than we have previously. 3, we are a increasingly retiring generation because baby boomers are leaving the workforce, and we do not have an equal number of adults stepping into the positions they're vacating. So we see some baby boomers, we do actually see some people working longer so that they can stay in the workforce. Or in the case of education, we're reaching back to them and asking them to come back from retirement because we can't fill their positions. 4, I would say we're a grieving generation. And I think sometimes this gets left out in all the conversations about life getting back to normal after COVID. But during the pandemic, the vast majority of deaths were our aging population. More than 800,000 of the pandemic-related deaths in the U.S. alone were people 65 years and older. And so sometimes I think we forget the grief that our communities have gone through in the loss of a significant part of that generation. And then number 5, while we're seeing the economy as we've been facing inflation, we've had a stagnant immigrant growth population, fewer older people working, a tighter job market because of that. And so now we have people with job mobility in ways that they've not had previously either. So all of these, and not to mention the epidemic of loneliness and isolation and depression and all the other anxieties that people face in today's society. So I just say those things because sometimes I think that when we are asking, like, how should leaders face, what's the question that they're facing? I think the question that they're facing is complex. It's a complexity of societal pressures that you're stepping into every day when you're encountering a child in a family. Mm-hmm. And they may be coming into your situation being touched by many or all of those things that I just mentioned in some form. Or your ability to employ may be faced by some of those same things too. Even with our teacher shortages, some of that is faced by some of these other dynamics too. So there's three things I want to leave you with. One is, I believe instead of trying to come up with a prescription, it's important for us to think wisely in how we respond where we live, in the place and time where we live. So the first thing I would say is raise awareness. It's important for you to, as you are aware of things as a leader, even like Dr. Jean Twing's research on the use of phones and their anxiety producing effects on students, it's probably impossible for you to prescribe how parents and their children should use phones. But it is important that you help them be aware of those things so that you can together make wiser choices about the use of them. Number two, I would say we've got to ensure that every school is a place of safety and belonging. One of the things that Jean Twing said in her research is that people are seeking emotional snacks in social media when what they're really yearning for is the feasting that's found in real life community. Mm-hmm. And so I just can't think of a better way for a school community to view itself in a place where you can find the feast of real life relationship. Mm-hmm. So how do you create a place where everyone feels safe and they feel like they belong, even when they come in with differences? And especially in all the cultural wars that are going right now, I think the school leaders who I admire the most are the ones who, I don't know how to say this safely, but I'm just going to say it the way Will would say it, that take a pacifist position. I'm not going to get in here and start slinging and fighting among the war. I'm going to create a place where no matter what position you bring into this conversation, I'm going to show you dignity and respect. Mm-hmm. I'm going to model for you how to live together in a way where you can even disagree and still like each other. Mm-hmm. And then three, we need places where young people feel like their voices are heard. And so I'll end with this story. There was a young man in that focus group, college student getting ready to go into his senior year. And as we were talking specifically about social media and phones, he raised his hand and he just said, "Can I just add a few thoughts here?" And we said, yes. And he said, and I'll paraphrase his story. He said, "I was born September 11th. I was born that month was my birth." And he said, "I have never known in my entire life anything but crisis as a young person growing up in this world." And he said, "I just need you to know from my generation's perspective that in this part I wrote down, in a world where older generations seem to hold the majority of power, young people don't see where we have an opportunity or permission to have a voice. So we flee to social media because that seems to be a place where we can find other people who give us permission to talk and be heard, especially among our peers." And so I was so grateful when he said that. I just paused and said, "Can I just applaud you for saying back to us, especially we older ones that just love to talk about you, something that is so important for us to hear, which is that if we're going to create solutions for the stresses that technology is creating, we also have to make sure that part of that solution is not just inviting students to the table, but giving them voice at the table, letting them be a part of the solution too." So I don't know if that answers your question. I wanted to leave those thoughts with your listeners today too.
Well, thank you very much. Will, you remind me of Chaucer's Scholar, where he says, "And gladly would he learn and gladly teach." Tell my audience where they can get in touch with you and find out more. Pick your prodigious brain about education.
Well, my website is easy to find. It's my name, williamdparker.com. Or if you are a podcast listener, you can just look for Principal Matters, the school, Leaders podcast. And anywhere you listen to podcasts, you'll find those episodes there. I would love to connect. If you want to email me, my email address is will@williamdparker.com. And I'm happy to have a conversation or jump on the phone. If you've got a school leader that you would love me to connect with, please introduce me, because that's the joy of my work, is connecting with leaders and helping them love their students.
Well, you certainly convey that. And thank you very much for your time, and we'll send you on your way. Thank you. Subscribe and review Conversation Balloons on your favorite podcast platform. Find me at leahfarish.com and on Instagram at LeahFarish.